Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Jacobin talk. My name is Meagan Day. I'm a staff writer at Jacobin magazine. Every week at 6 p.m. Eastern on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, we've been hosting a left-wing thinker to talk about an important political issue for 25 or 30 minutes. Before I introduce tonight's guest, I just want to briefly plug that on Saturday, we have another episode of our Weekends show with Anna Kasparian and Nando Vila. This week's guest is Jacobin contributing editor and non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, Daniel Bessner. And on Monday at 6 p.m. Eastern, we have Owen Hatherley to make a defense of what he calls militant modernism and reclaim the countercultural possibilities of modernism as an essential part of the socialist effort to transform society. Tonight, I'm joined by Jacobin executive editor Seth Ackerman to talk about how the left should assess the Constitution, the problems with American federalism, and the power of the courts. Seth has written an editorial for the forthcoming print issue of Jacobin that addresses this topic. This is building on his previous work. He also wrote an article about this in 2011 called provocatively, "Burn the Constitution." I had the pleasure of reading Seth's editorial for the forthcoming print issue of Jacobin before it came out. And I want to highlight one of its concepts just to introduce the topic. Seth writes that the European radical Democrats, especially in Britain, really overstated the democratic nature of the US Constitution. But British conservatives saw it for what it really was, a counter-revolutionary document booby-trapped against majoritarian or popular influence. So for example, in 1885, Seth dug this up. The conservative British legal theorist Henry Maine observed that while the British Constitution has been insensibly transforming itself into a popular government surrounded on all sides by difficulties, the American federal Constitution has proved that nearly a century ago, several expedients were discovered by which some of those difficulties may be greatly mitigated and some altogether overcome. Obviously, that's very euphemistic language, right? But Seth is here to explain what some of these expedients to get around these difficulties the framers, discovered, and how American politics has grown up around them and what kind of political legacy they've left behind. Before he begins, I want to ask you to please hit like, please hit subscribe, and please share this video with your friends. Now, take it away, Seth.
Thank you, Meagan. So I wrote this article, Burn the Constitution, quite a number of years ago, and it was a number of years ago, but it was a political moment that was in some ways a little bit like the one that we're in now, because it was a moment when a lot of people were coming to realize, it was sort of dawning on a lot of people that there's something wrong with American politics, and that America is sort of a country that's going through a kind of a slow motion rolling crisis. And that was a feeling that was very strong at the time. So this was like the time of the Tea Party, 2011, 2012. So it was like the Tea Party Congress had come in, and there was, a tremendous amount of dysfunction in Washington because of the push and pull between Republicans in Congress and Obama. There was the debt ceiling crises and all those kinds of things, if people remember those. And it seemed like to a lot of people, believe it or not, at the time, this is what seemed like the standard of craziness was like the debt ceiling standoff. But it seemed like something had gone really wrong with American politics. So people were trying to figure out what that was. And so this article was really my attempt to give my take on it. And my take is very much rooted in the Constitution. The Constitution and in American political institutions generally. Institutions are really important. They last a long time. They're hard to change. And so as a result, they end up becoming just sort of part of the furniture, the mental furniture that people have about the world around them. And so people, and this is really, I think, the important thing, people adapt to the institutions that they find themselves in. So when I talk about the Constitution, which I'm going to get into in a minute, I think it's important to not fall into the trap of thinking that, how often do we really have to deal with the issues of the Constitution? How often do we have to? I mean, what is the actual concrete connection between the specific craziness in our politics today and a particular provision of a constitution that tells you how you elect the government? But in the reality is that it's precisely because it's hard to tell what that connection is, because we're so immersed in the institution. It's so obvious. It's so implicit for us that, for example, in order for a law to pass, it has to pass 2 houses of Congress, and then the president has to sign it. Those are things that just seem natural, but they are obviously political choices that were embodied in the Constitution. And then everyone knowing that adapts to that reality, and they change their behavior and they change their assumptions. And it's the behavior and the assumptions that over time compound to get to the kind of craziness that we see. So what am I talking about? So the U.S. Constitution, I'm sure probably most people listening have at least an inkling of this, but the U.S. Constitution is an extremely unusual, exceptional, unique document. Most countries these days have written constitutions, but no other country. The U.S. Constitution is exceptional on a lot of different metrics and by a lot of different standards. So, for example, it is more or less the oldest constitution in the world. And I mean, it's, when you think about it, it's really, really old. I mean, to be governed by a document that was written 200 some years ago, again, we're really used to that. But everywhere else, that seems very strange, because the first thing people would ask is, well, wouldn't it get out of date? And I think an American would probably laugh at that and say, well, that's part of the magic and the mystery of the Constitution, is that it has this timeless wisdom. But in reality, it is incredibly out of date, and it embodies these 18th century ideas. And the reason why it's so old, so exceptionally old, again, most countries that have written constitutions, those constitutions were written, in the last century, and they're amended very frequently. So that's the key difference, is that because the U.S. Constitution is so difficult to amend, it's virtually impossible to amend on any issue that's at all controversial. That's what accounts for its tremendous age. And so a lot of what politics is about in this country is political actors trying to figure out how to get around the provisions of the Constitution, how to make it functional. And it has been commented on many times over the years. Long before there was a sense that America was in this inextricable political crisis. Back when it was, there used to be a time when the United States was seen as this great success story of democracy, and the basket cases were all the countries, let's say in Europe, that were always threatening to plunge into fascism or something like that, or threatened by by a Bolshevik revolution or something like that. And the United States was a picture of political stability. But even then, it was often something that people would comment on, knowledgeable observers of constitutional law or the structure of different polities. They would say, it's amazing that the US Constitution, when you read it, that it functions at all. And it was amazing. And I think that that's in some ways the thing that really has to be explained, is how did it function at all, rather than why is it that it seems like it's breaking down today. That's the real puzzle, is how it worked at all. Let me get to some of the aspects of the Constitution that are so problematic. Most of them fall under the heading of what you could call a problem of veto points. And this was a deliberate part of the design of the Constitution. So the Constitution is also unique in the number of actors, political actors, who are given the ability to basically stop things from happening. And that was part of the philosophy, the intentional philosophy of the Constitution, as dreamed up by James Madison and the other framers the framers of the Constitution in 1787 at the Constitutional Convention. And to get a sense of what the significance of that is, you have to, I think, go back to the context of the writing of the Constitution. because this issue of veto points was really something that was foremost in their minds at the time. And the reason it was like that was because this was 1787 was, just a little over a decade after the beginning of the American Revolution. It was just a few years after the end of the Revolutionary War. And the existing Constitution of the United States was the Articles of Confederation. So it was a very loose confederation. Most people didn't even really think of themselves as citizens of the United States. They saw themselves as citizens of the state that they lived in. And the United States was a little bit more like the European Union. It was sort of like this higher level association that people didn't really have that much of a passionate attachment to compared to their attachment to their own state. So at the time, the issue as far as the structure of government, how government worked, was really an issue of the state governments and the state constitutions. And most of the state constitutions had been written when the United States declared independence, and so now they all needed to have their own written documents. In most cases, they already had various charters, but it was thought that under the new circumstances, now that we all believe in republicanism and we want to break away from Britain, we have to revise these and and live up to the spirit of this kind of democratic spirit of this revolution. So the states were governed by these constitutions that were written at a moment of great revolutionary enthusiasm, and the best example of that was the Constitution of Pennsylvania, which was a famous document at the time. And it was commented on and republished all throughout Europe. Benjamin Franklin was one of the main drafters of it. His name was closely associated with it. And the Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776 was like the opposite of the United States Constitution of today. It was a highly democratic document that deliberately went out of its way to try to make the connection between what the electorate, what the people wanted, and what the government did as much of an intimate, close connection as possible. And Pennsylvania's Constitution was the best example of that, but it wasn't the only example. And Vermont was another very avant-garde democratic constitution. And the result, the net outcome of this by 1787 was extremely alarming to James Madison and many of the other founders. And the reason for that is that the United States was going through a really difficult period economically. It was one of the worst economic periods after the war was over, the kind of depression that the country sank into, and it was burdened by a lot of debt. And in order to repay the debts, these are debts owed to foreign creditors. The states, ultimately the debts were owed by the states. They were the ones who took out the loans. In order to pay them back, they had to tax. They had to tax their citizens, who were mostly farmers who didn't really have a lot of cash with which to pay. They were kind of bleeding, like trying to squeeze blood from a stone. And the U.S. At the time probably really didn't have the capacity to fully pay back its debts. This is kind of a story that may be familiar to a lot of people when you hear about this problem of unpayable debts. But the response in places like Pennsylvania on the part of farmers who were, they were losing their land, they were losing their farms because they had unpaid tax bills and their land was being seized and sold at auction and then bought up by speculators. And this is a people who were still in kind of swept up in a revolutionary mood from the time of the revolution. What they did was they said, well, let's change the law. And so they had they militated for their state governments to implement all kinds of policies that were all variations on kind of an inflationary policy to basically like just create enough money so that it became easier to pay their taxes, so they wouldn't lose their land. And of course, that meant that when people were repaid, when the creditors were repaid, they were repaid in depreciated currency, and so it was a kind of expropriation of property from creditors. And this was more than anything else, more than even the really serious like diplomatic and geopolitical problems that the country was facing at the time. Even more than that, this issue of the citizens of these states fighting for and winning from their governments these measures of what were basically redistributionary measures, despoiling the rich, so to speak, was the most disturbing thing about a very generally disturbing political situation in the United States at the time. And that was what what convinced people like James Madison and many of the other framers that they needed to intervene and have a drastic change. And there you have James Madison looking appropriately appalled by the despoliation of the creditors. So the problem that Madison and the other framers faced, and by the way, they were not writing this Constitution because they had been authorized to do that by any kind of Congress or Assembly. They sort of did it on false pretenses. There was no provision for this in the existing Constitution, and they basically claimed that they were just having a meeting to, deliberate about certain specific changes in their commercial policy of the United States. But they ended up, coming out with this whole new Constitution. So the problem that they faced when they were writing this Constitution, and of course the writers of this were, like James Madison, pretty much all wealthy gentry, landowning elites. They were the elites of the time from their various states. The problem they faced was they wanted to change the political situation so that there would never again be a situation like the one where these states were implementing these redistributionary measures because their electorates had demanded it. But the United States and the colonies before the United States had the broadest voting rights, the broadest suffrage, which were still obviously very highly restricted, but the broadest in the world at the time. So women could not vote, blacks could not vote, even free blacks. Obviously, non-citizens couldn't vote, and yet the percentage of the population who could vote, the percentage of adult men, let's say, who could vote, was the highest of any country in the world. And this had been the case for a long time. And the reason for that was not because the people in charge were particularly enlightened, but it was because they really didn't have a choice. The United States happened to be located in a place where there was just a very large amount of land that you could seize from the original inhabitants. So if you felt oppressed by your government, by your respective governments as an American citizen, and you felt like you didn't have voting rights, the government was doing bad things to you, you could very easily just sort of pick up and leave and try to make it out west. So, and then you were the labor and they needed your labor. So that was a problem. And so as a result, like in many places around the world that had a lot of land for people to be able to cultivate, the rulers at the time felt like they had no choice but to grant an unusually high degree of rights, including voting rights. So that was what Americans were used to at the time the Constitutional Convention started. They were accustomed to having a broad franchise, and they believed it to be their right. And they also believed that that was what they had been fighting for in the Revolutionary War. It was among the things that they were fighting for. So there was no question in the minds of the framers that there was no way that they could, whether at the state level or at the level of the new federal government or whatever, they were not going to be able to just disenfranchise people the way that the Southern planter class disenfranchised African Americans in the South after the populist movement in the late 1890s. So in that case, how exactly were they going to go about making sure that this sort of ultra democracy didn't strike again? And that's where these veto points come in. So when you look at, for example, the fact that our Congress has two chambers and not one, that's a very deliberate choice. A bicameral legislature was seen at the time, most importantly, as a political choice that helped to preserve, a quote unquote aristocratic government, because for two reasons. One was that the upper chamber usually had a more aristocratic personnel in charge, and the people who get elected to the Senate or a House or appointed to a House of Lords are usually like higher status. But also for a more just basic structural reason, which is that if you have two chambers that both have to approve a law, for example, to have a law passed, it is much less likely that the people are going to be able to, in a frenzy of ultra egalitarian revolutionary Jacobinism, that they're going to be able to organize and force through a law that would strip creditors of their rights to be repaid in full, for example. And that's something that famously Madison talked about in Federalist 10, in one of the Federalist Papers, where he gave his reasons and his rationale for the kinds of choices that he had defended in the Constitutional Convention. And this concept, this idea of setting up barriers to what would sometimes be, they would say hasty political change, was the way that they would do it. So you would have the veto points in the Constitution that are particularly notable. For example, are the two chambers of the Congress, the fact that the president has a veto over legislation. But then you also have something that's not quite the same thing as a veto point, but another similar related concept that Madison talked about as sort of the idea of the extended republic. The idea that you have, you've divided the country up into a number of states, and you have to have a certain amount of unanimity, not necessarily literal unanimity, but you have to have a lot of the different geographic areas agree before some change is made. And so that is, that's certainly the situation that you have when you're trying to amend the Constitution. You need a certain number of states. But there are a lot of other situations, including just if you, for example, if you wanted to start a political party, you would need to be able to get, if you wanted a majority, you would need to get majorities in a lot of different places. And so for Madison, that was another mechanism that you could use to ensure that you would slow down one of these movements, of these overly hasty movements of radicalism. And when you say slow down, anybody who's familiar with how radical movements work realize that to slow down the momentum of a movement like that, and certainly Madison understood this, he was a very sophisticated sort of political scientist for his day, any attempt to slow it down is also really a way of killing it. So the structure of the Constitution was designed explicitly, Madison talked about it, it was designed and it was perceived at the time as a way, in the terminology or the vocabulary of the day, it was an aristocratic. It was, it was relative to the mood of the American polity at the time and the constitutions that were in place. It was not. It was certainly not the most dictatorial or absolutist constitution in the world. It didn't install a monarchy or anything like that. And certainly the founders and the framers were operating within certain political limits that they couldn't cross. But relative to where they had started, they very deliberately drafted a constitution that was an attempt to significantly reduce the ability of the people at large, the electorate, for example, to control what the government did. What they wanted was a government not that would be some unaccountable despotism and dictatorship that would trample on the people, slaughter people when they spoke up in protest or something like that. But what they wanted was a government where, despite the fact that people had the right to vote, they would not actually be able to, in any tangible way, have any direct connection between what they wanted and what their representatives did. They didn't want the representatives to be like delegates who were given instructions and who carried out the instructions. They wanted the representatives to be people who were the best men, who would deliberate and use their wisdom and their knowledge and their learning to figure out what the best policy is, and not take instruction and direction from an ignorant electorate. That was the basic idea. And what's remarkable is that as we've gone down through the years, that vision, those intentions have been really, in one way, remarkably realized, for reasons that we can get into maybe a little bit when we talk when Meagan comes back. But more importantly, the point that I really was hoping to make, both in Burn the Constitution and in the editorial I just wrote that's going to be in the next issue, is that this is at the root of the crisis that we are facing politically in this country, is that is this the clash between these expectations on the part of, and the political culture that gives rise to these expectations, these democratic expectations that most people have, that the ultimate legitimate authority is the final say in our country, because we're a democracy. It's the people. The people are sovereign. That's the sort of basic expectation. There's a sense that so-and-so wasn't elected, so they don't have the right to decide this or that. There's still that fundamental feeling. So popular sovereignty is really like the only ultimate legitimate authority that Americans will recognize when it comes to like who gets to say what the government is going to do and what the state is going to do. And yet, even though popular sovereignty is the only legitimate mechanism, it's not actually possible for majorities, electoral majorities, to act in a concerted way, to formulate a program and get their, recruit representatives to push for that program and put those representatives in office. The whole series of steps that in the modern era, mass politics has, created a set of like steps and institutions by which people have been able to and can do that kind of thing. If you want a major adjustment in the way that your government works and what the policies are, those are the steps you would take. Those are the steps that precisely those steps that are sort of blocked, the path that's blocked by the Constitution and by a lot of the other institutions that sort of jibe with or fit in with the constitutional framework. And so as a result, you have a vacuum of responsibility. No one is responsible. And you can see this really, really clearly in the sort of day-to-day politics of especially people like Mitch McConnell. We can talk about that more. But I think that like Mitch McConnell is to me a perfect example of the sort of the consequences of the kind of system we have. He famously, in the early Obama years, when the Republicans gained a majority in the Senate, he made a decision, which I think he kind of openly talked about. He admitted that he said, Obama wanted to have a health reform. He wanted to have a big health reform bill, and he hoped that it would be bipartisan. And we had to make a decision. Were we going to like play ball with Obama and say, well, and try to and say we were going to help him in exchange for his bill, compromising with us and incorporating our ideas, or were we just going to oppose it? And he said, if we were to cooperate with Obama and try to get our ideas in the bill, even if we did get our ideas in the bill, he would get the credit, and we would be helping him out, because that's just the way that our system works, and that's the way that people perceive politics. Obama was the one who wanted health reform, and Obama was the one who got the Rose Garden ceremony where he had a bipartisan bill and everybody's happy and everybody's shaking hands. And McConnell realized that because there is this disconnect between the actual way that the government works and the way that any kind of visible assignment of responsibility of who in the government was responsible for what and who's to blame for what, because that's all obscured by the fact that there's a million different veto points and everyone gets a say and everyone can stop the proceedings and therefore demand something and get that in. It's a sort of a situation where no one has a final authority. It makes it impossible. It severs that connection between the electorate and what they want and the government. How do people, ordinary people, intervene in politics if they can't figure out who is to blame, what was done, who did it, and then have any way of reversing it in any kind of like transparent, direct way? That that's a sort of really general, vague way of putting it, but that's part of the I think part of the issue that part of the connection between a constitution that was written 200 years ago and the specific problems that we're facing today.
So I think I'm not alone in this. I think that I have heard more about potential changes to the structure of the US state in the last year from liberals than I have in my entire life. In fact, even at the debate the other day, Joe Biden was asked about, are you going to pack the courts? Are you going to end the filibuster? This seems unusual to me. Is it true that liberals, there's a growing consciousness among liberals about the anti-democratic, anti-majoritarian features of the United States right now that is unusual? Is my perception that this is an anomalous moment in history for that level of consciousness? Is that correct? And if so, what do you think the implications are?
I think that's absolutely right.
Also, why is that happening?
That's part of that sense that the country's going through a political crisis, but it really specifically, I think, a lot of it is about just the partisan setup. Sorry, my computer may be running out of juice in a second. I may have to go a few steps across the room and rescue my charger, which I didn't realize was not here. But let me just finish that thought. I think that that liberals traditionally have been very sentimental about the Constitution in a kind of West Wing way. And what's been happening in the last few years is that their West Wing expectations of how the government is supposed to work are being violated by these the norm erosion, the destruction of norms by radical Republicans. First, it was McConnell and the Tea Party, and then it was Donald Trump, and they're realizing that it's all that the structural features of the government as it exists today, rather than being what they used to think, which was, oh yeah, it frustrates everyone, but isn't that great? It frustrates everyone. It's so frustrating, but that's part of the magic and the beauty of our system, which is actually something I'm almost quoting Jill Lepore, the Harvard historian, who I quoted her in Burn the Constitution all those many years ago, when she wrote something like that. The Constitution it's so magical and mysterious because everyone gets frustrated by it at some point. So I guess in her view, that makes it sort of fair. But now it's more and more it's becoming clear that it's pretty much always the same side that's getting frustrated by the existing institutional setup. It's always the Democrats. It's always the liberals. For reasons that we could talk about that are somewhat, I guess, arbitrary. Like the Senate, for example, is extremely lopsided in its representation because it gives every state equal representation, which means that small states are overrepresented. And there's no law of nature that says that small states have to be more conservative than big states, but that's just the way it happens to be, and it's getting more and more so as population shifts take place. So that's an example. And the filibuster, maybe just for the pure coincidental reason that there have been more years lately when there's been a Democrat in the White House and Republicans in the Senate with the majority. Maybe it's just that, as simple as that. And so liberals have been unusually attuned to the problematicness of the filibuster. And if the shoe was on the other foot, maybe they wouldn't feel that way. That's another. Oh, and of course the Supreme Court. That's really important because I think for modern liberalism, the Supreme Court is for reasons that are quite problematic in part. But in any case, modern liberalism sees the Supreme Court as being sort of one of the major stakes of politics, which it is. And just on that one, they've been losing like hell. So naturally, they start thinking about ways to change things. We can talk about this. I'm curious what you think, but my sense is that that you're right, that there's been more talk about institutional reform to deal with the problems of a counter-majoritarian system than there has been in a long time. There's been a lot of talk about getting rid of the filibuster and expanding the Supreme Court. I am quite pessimistic that that if Joe Biden wins and if the Democrats win a majority in the Senate, that any of those things are actually going to happen. I think that the Democrats actually are the leadership of the Democratic Party certainly is really, they grew up in a system that had certain rules and rules of the ground rules and expectations, and they like it that way. And I seriously doubt that Joe Biden. Dianne Feinstein came out recently and said that she's not going to support getting rid of the filibuster, or I think expanding the Supreme Court. And I think that you're going to find that there's very few, or surprisingly few Democrats who are going to be willing to do it. And I think the whole thing is going to fizzle out. Because when you think about it, if it were so easy to get rid of, to change the rules, then the rules wouldn't be a problem in the first place. In other words, the filibuster imposes this supermajority requirement on you. If it was so easy to get a majority to get rid of the supermajority, then why didn't this happen a long time ago? I think that there's more support for it now than there was in the past. I'm sure that there's more senators who, if forced to, would vote for it for those things today than before. But the deeper structural reasons why they were there in the first place and why they were tolerated those things are still there.
You say that the Democrats kind of just don't want to pursue it, and I think that you're completely right. I also think it's true that even if they did, the apparatus isn't really there, in part because, I mean, we talk about how the Democrats are sort of like toothless or don't have backbone, whatever metaphor. It's also true that the Democrats just aren't like a programmatic mass party, and in fact, we don't have programmatic mass parties in the United States. We have some other type of entity, and I noticed in the editorial that you wrote for the forthcoming issue of Jacobin, you mentioned that this is actually also a consequence to some extent of the way that the Constitution was written. And that has implications not only for liberals, but also for leftists. It certainly has implications for anyone who would like to do any kind of mass mobilization to have a political revolution of some kind to change this state of affairs. So this seems to be a paradox, a really unfortunate bind that we're in. Can you explain a little bit how our lack of a programmatic mass party or a culture of programmatic mass parties sort of relates to the structure of the Constitution?
Yes. So the political parties that we ended up with and the party system that we ended up with were themselves reactions to and shaped by the institutional system that they had to deal with as parties that wanted to win elections and control the government. And so among the aspects of the constitutional setup that Madison and his fellow framers installed to make things as difficult as possible for Democratic majorities to get their way was a pretty radical decentralization, combined with a lot of sort of supermajority requirements on a geographic level. So you have to get majorities in a lot of different places, and as a result, that was one of the key factors that brought about when we got actual institutional political parties in, like, let's say the 1840s. When that finally happened, those parties were operating in a very decentralized system, and so the individual politicians who were participating in those parties and helping to build those parties were intensely focused on their local political situation. Most of them didn't really care very much about what the national program of their party was. They cared about winning an election in their particular district, keeping control of their state legislature. And as a result, they designed these parties themselves to reflect the decentralization of the government. So, our political parties from the beginning, and it's still the case today, they were even more so then, they are parties that, unlike most organizations, don't have any kind of central governing bodies that can formulate and impose a policy. So there's no like party conference the way there is like in the Labour Party or in other political parties around the world, where the members and leaders of the party deliberate and decide on a policy, and then that policy becomes, at least in theory, the one that the elected officials are supposed to follow and pursue in Parliament, for example. So, I mean, political parties around the world, they're always on some spectrum of how centralized, how much discipline, how much party discipline and programmatic discipline there is. American parties have always been way, way off to the side as being extremely decentralized. And by the same Madisonian logic, and in a second, I'm going to go run over there and get my charger. But by that same Madisonian logic, that makes it just as much of an obstacle in the same Madisonian sort of extended republic sense of changing things, because in order to change things, you have to change, government policy, which means you have to get majorities in a lot of different places. But to do that, you need politicians who are going to advocate those changes, which means advocate those changes in a lot of different places. So you need a party that has a uniform policy in all across the country, districts all around. And the parties that actually arose, the Whigs and the Democrats and then the Republicans and the Democrats, reflecting the structure of the government, had no way of doing that. They had no institutional mechanism for, kind of fighting for and winning at a sort of a central party level, a change in policy that then would be imposed on all of the elected officials so that they would then have to vote for that program, and the program would pass because that's what the members of the party wanted. In fact, our political parties are very unusual in that they don't even have members, which is that's something that I know that is an issue that's dear to your heart, Meagan. But I'm gonna run over for 1 second. I'll be right back.
Please do. I have an address to the people who are watching this on YouTube. First of all, hello, and thank you for tuning in. And second of all, I have a couple of additional questions for Seth that I'm happy to ask, but we'd actually like to prioritize your questions if you have any. So take a moment and think about what you would like to ask Seth. You can type it into the chat on the YouTube page, and it will be fed to me somehow through mystical or magical means. And then I will ask your question to Seth, and then he will answer it. As you can see, I'm filling the time with as many words as possible. In any case, yes, Seth is right. This is an issue that is near and dear to me. I think it's important to have membership parties, membership organizations in general, and we lack democratic structures almost entirely in the United States. The most common arena in which a person is likely to experience democracy directly is if they happen to be like a deacon on their church's board of elders or something like that, and even that is something that's disappearing from the public sphere. Seth is back, so I no longer have to talk about church democracy. So Seth, I would like to hear what you, this is a very general question, but I think it's one that a lot of people are a bit confused on. I'd like to hear what you think the socialist line on the American Revolution should be. How should socialists be thinking about the American Revolution, the nation's founding, the Constitution in general? Very open-ended question, but what do you think?
I mean, this is, I think, one of those issues that your answered question says something about your kind of general way of seeing politics. Different socialists will have very different views on this because there's just different general approaches to left-wing politics. My view, which I think is maybe the more old school view, is that an old school view with maybe a little bit of a twist. So I guess the way I would put it is that the American Revolution was sort of a revolution betrayed. You know, it was a classic example of that's sort of a cliched story of the 20th century. Usually, it's like an anti-left wing or an anti-communist line that they had a revolution that was full of idealism and people wanted change and the people were in motion. And then when the revolutionaries came to power, they betrayed it by usually, in the 20th century version, by like setting up a dictatorship instead of some kind of a socialist democracy or something. And it was very similar, in my opinion. This is not the way that Americans typically think about the American Revolution, but I think it's a similar story. The actual revolutionary period, it had the feel of a revolution. There was it had the kind of mobilization and the kind of dynamics that happen in a lot of revolutions, where initially it's just some elites who are fighting with other elites. They have like a conflict, an intra-elite conflict, and then and that's sort of normal politics. And then that conflict, for whatever reason, it becomes insoluble, and the two sides of the elite radicalize, and then one side feels like in order to win, they have to kind of mobilize the common people. And to do that, they have to couch their cause in the language of equality and democracy and rights and all that kind of stuff. And then that process then takes on a life of its own. Once you start mobilizing people with that language and with those ideas, it becomes sort of hard to get the toothpaste back in the tube, as it were. And to a large extent, those kinds of situations, revolutionary situations, change the people who are in them, change the people even who are the protagonists of it. So often the elites themselves will sort of get some of the revolutionary spirit, at least for a while. And so the actual revolutionary period, I think, to me, it's part of the story, the prehistory of socialism. There's a straight line from the American Revolution to the French Revolution, and certainly Marx would have been the first to say that there was a straight line, maybe not a straight line, but maybe like a slightly wavy line, from the French Revolution to socialism, to the socialist movement. And and you can, I think that you can see, if you look closely, you can see those steps. Now, the American Revolution is also a revolution of settler colonists. The United States was obviously the American colonies were a project of settler colonialism. So it was about appropriating the land that was not originally there, so that white men could have a little plot of means of production. And it was also a place, where the material basis of society relied to a large extent, depending on where you're talking about and what you're talking about, it relied on slavery. Although I would argue that, I would say this, there's been a lot of talk since the 1619 Project about the American Revolution and slavery. And I think that, to me, one of the reasons why I say that I think that the American Revolution should be seen as a revolution betrayed is because in the actual American Revolution, the moment of 1776 is a moment when many of the northern states, most of the northern states, I think, abolished or set slavery on the road to be abolished after 100, 150 years of never even questioning the idea of slavery. And it was because those ideas that people were mobilizing around in as part of the revolution had a real effect. And I think there's something that I read a while ago, which was there's a historical sociologist who named Randolph Roth, who studies crime. And he did a historical study of the homicide rate in America historically, and he found that the United States and the colonies were one of the lowest homicide places in the world until the American Revolution, when the South suddenly became a very high homicide place, and it has been ever since. And having studied the period really closely, his conclusion was that the reason for that is because the American Revolution involved this language of rights and equality, and of course the Declaration of Independence said something that made a lot of people nervous, which was that all men are created equal. And that was something that contradiction between the everyday reality of subordination and the ostensible commitment of these slaveholders to these egalitarian ideas created tensions that were actually manifested themselves on a day-to-day basis in the South, in interpersonal relations, where hierarchies that had never been questioned suddenly were being questioned. And, given, I guess, the culture of honor or whatever in the South, it led to a lot of interpersonal violence. So the effects are really profound. I mean, in other words, the revolutionary ideas and spirit, the egalitarianism of it, were not just, just a few words, despite the fact that it was a revolution of settler colonists, despite the fact it was a revolution that slaveholders participated in. It was, I think, pretty much all of the ideas and causes and aspects of socialism that are dear to socialists today and were for the last couple hundred years. You can find the germs of them in the American Revolution, but at the same time, especially given what I'm talking about here, what happened just a few years after the Revolutionary War was over, it was also a revolution betrayed. There was a counter-revolution that may not have been acknowledged, but it was there.
As a side note, picking up on something that you said, there is a similar thesis advanced in Barbara and Karen Field's book Racecraft, where they sort of posit the idea that the dehumanizing notions sort of constitute American racism as it comes to evolve are actually a correction mechanism to deal with the fact that if all men are created equal, then we have to make some men less than men in order to square the circle. I recommend people check that out. So it looks like we're coming close to the end of the hour. We actually got a lot of good questions. It's hard to choose, but it seems like more than one person, in fact, several people are asking what a socialist constitution or a workers' constitution would look like, or barring that, maybe not, you don't have to answer what the sort of ideal constitution would look like, but at the very least, what changes might be most desirable, or what structure might be most desirable to attempt to implement?
I think there's a lot of things, but there's probably one most important thing. The person that you mentioned at the beginning there, Sir Henry Maine, who was the preeminent jurist and legal scholar of the 19th century, and his books are still taught in every law school. I'm sure anybody who's gone to law school and took any of the classes on like legal history or sociology of law or anything had to read him. Was like one of the major intellectuals of the 19th century in general. But he was also quite a reactionary who hated the democratic trend of politics, and he was a big admirer of the American Constitution. And for him, what he called Article 5 of the Constitution, something like the keystone of the crown, or something like that, the keystone in the arch of the American polity. So Article 5 of the Constitution is the article that says how you can amend the Constitution, and it's ridiculously hard. It's the American Constitution is the hardest in the world to amend. And I was actually delighted the other day when I was writing this article, and I went and I started reading Maine's writing about the American Constitution, and I realized that he did the same thing that I did when I wrote Burn the Constitution several years ago. He must have gotten the idea from me. That he went and counted how, because it's kind of crazy. In order for a constitutional amendment to pass, it has to pass both houses of Congress, I think 2/3, and then then you have to get 3/4 of the state legislatures to adopt it. And so each state legislature has 2 chambers. So you can do the math. How many separate legislative chambers in the country have to adopt the same document, and none of them are actually required to even take a vote on it. So they all have to like decide to take a vote. And the answer that I came up with in Burn the Constitution, I think, was like 78 different legislative bodies have to all vote for and ratify, according to whatever their rules are, the same constitutional amendment. That is insane. I mean, if you compare it to any other constitution in the world, there's nothing like that. There's nothing like that in any other constitution, not even close. Usually it's something like both houses or one house of the legislature has to pass it by like 60%. Sometimes it'll be like, well, you have to pass it twice, once after an election, so that like the people have their say, or sometimes it's a referendum. So I think that Maine was right that it's the keystone and the arch of the whole system, because all of the specific things that we can complain about are all things where you can argue about it. You can say, maybe there should be, maybe there should be a supermajority requirement for this or that, or maybe there should be a Supreme Court that has the right to strike down laws, although that's not actually in the Constitution at all. You can argue about these things, but the important point is that if you actually if you're going to have a system where the people really are sovereign, then you have to have a realistic possibility of the people to actually exercise their sovereignty and determine their own fundamental law, which is the Constitution. And to have an impossible amendment process, I think what it does is, in my opinion, it kind of delegitimizes all of the specific things in the Constitution, because none of them are the considered desired deliberate decisions, even tacitly, of the existing electorate or the existing public. They're just diktats that are handed down to us from previous generation that we have no choice about, because actually amending the Constitution is so difficult. So I think that that once you have a reasonable amendment process, then you can have arguments about all the specific things. But what I think you definitely would get if you had a reasonable amendment process is a very different Constitution. No country would willingly adopt the Constitution we have today, and so if we could change it, we would change it. That's for sure.
Thanks so much, Seth. We're coming up on the hour. Everyone, be sure to read Seth's 2011 article, Burn the Constitution, and then be sure to look for Seth's upcoming editorial in the next print issue of Jacobin, which will be a sort of updated version of this, specifically talking about the theme of the issue, I believe, is a failed state. And I think that we all know what that means and what it refers to at this particular moment. And so Seth's going to use some of these ideas to examine the contemporary situation in the upcoming issue of Jacobin. And everyone, please also, I'm just going to put another plug here. Please tune in every week at 6 p.m. Eastern on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays for these, which are Jacobin Talks. And also check it out tomorrow, Saturday. There's another episode of Weekends with Anna Kasparian and Nando Vila. And this week's guest is going to be Daniel Bessner, who's a Jacobin contributing editor and a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. So thanks everyone for tuning in. Thank you so much, Seth, and see y'all later.
Thanks, Meagan.
Thank you.